Sable had not planned on stealing the Alpha King's war horse. She also had not stolen it, but that distinction seemed increasingly irrelevant, given that 12 armed soldiers were currently surrounding her cottage, and the most feared man in the Northern Territories was dismounting at her gate. The horse in question, a monstrous black stallion called Ethon that had been missing from the royal stables for 3 months, stood behind her in the garden like a very large, very expensive shadow. It had eaten her cabbages. All of them. It had also kicked a hole through her fence, drunk the rain barrel dry, and bitten a scout who had tried to loop a rope around its neck 4 days ago. What it had not done, despite the efforts of 6 handlers, 2 trackers, and 1 increasingly furious cavalry captain, was leave Sable pressed her back against the cottage wall and tried to make herself as small as possible. Which was not difficult, she was already small. The kind of small that made people look through her rather than at her. The kind of small that got you left on a stranger's doorstep as an infant with nothing but a wool blanket and someone else's hope that you would become someone else's problem. She watched the king come through the gate and felt her legs turn to water. Calder Voss was everything the rumors promised, and worse. He moved like a predator that had been temporarily convinced to walk upright. His shoulders blocked the morning light. His jaw looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountain passes his armies had bled to hold, and his eyes, pale gray and utterly devoid of warmth, swept across the scene with the calm efficiency of a man cataloging threat. Those eyes found the horse first, then they found her. Sable stopped breathing. "How long?" the king said. His voice was lower than she had expected, quieter too, which somehow made it worse. 3 months, your majesty." The cavalry captain stepped forward, his neck flushed with embarrassment. The animal appeared at the woman's property approximately 4 days ago. Every attempt to retrieve it has failed. The stallion becomes violent if approached by anyone other than the girl. The king's gaze did not leave Sable's face. She wished very badly that the wall behind her would open up and swallow her whole. "And who is the girl?" he asked. The captain hesitated. Sable saw his mouth work around words he did not want to say in front of his sovereign. "A reject, sire. Omega. Cast out from the Ashmore settlement 3 years past. She lives alone. No pack affiliation. No family, no standing." Each word landed like a small, precise stone, dropped from a great height. Sable felt them all but kept her face still. She had heard worse. She had heard worse from better men and from far less impressive heights. The trick was to go hollow, to let the words pass through the empty space where they expected to find soft tissue. She had perfected that trick a long time ago. The king turned away from the captain and walked toward the horse. Aethon stood motionless, watching his master approach. The stallion's ears flattened, his massive head lowered, but he did not move toward the king. Did not nicker in recognition, did not do any of the things a bonded warhorse should do upon seeing its rider after 3 months of separation. The king stopped 2 paces from the animal and extended his hand. "Aethon," he said, "come." Nothing happened. The word hung in the air between them. A command from an Alpha King to a creature that had obeyed his every word since it was foaled. The stallion's dark eyes held the king's for a long, terrible moment. Then, with the slow deliberation of a creature making a choice it knew would have consequences, Aethon turned away from his master, crossed the trampled garden in 4 heavy strides, and pressed his enormous head against Sable's shoulder. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. 12 soldiers stared. The cavalry captain's mouth fell open. Theron, the king's beta, who had been standing at the gate with his arms folded, went very still. Sable stood frozen with a warhorse the size of a small building leaning against her, its breath warm on her neck, its weight pushing her into the wall. She could feel the animal's heartbeat through the press of its jaw against her collarbone. Slow, calm, content, as though it had found exactly where it was meant to be and had no intention of leaving again. The king watched all of this. His face remained composed, but behind those pale eyes a fracture opened, brief and quickly sealed, but she caught it before it disappeared. It was not anger, it was hurt. "Sire," the captain began carefully. He turned to Theron, a look passed between them that Sable could not read, that made her stomach clench with fear. The beta stepped forward and addressed her in a voice so carefully neutral, it might as well have been a warning. "The horse goes where you go, and the king needs his horse." He paused, letting the words settle. "You will accompany us to the palace." Sable's hand had come up to rest on Ethan's neck without her realizing it. The stallion leaned harder into her, a warm, immovable wall of muscle and intention. "I did not take him," she said, hating the way her voice shook. "He came to me." "No one is accusing you of theft," Theron replied. But he did not say what they were accusing her of, and the omission felt worse. She looked past Theron to the king. Caldervas stood at the edge of her ruined garden, his hands loose at his sides, staring at his horse pressed against a nameless, packless nothing of a girl. And for one fleeting, unguarded moment, the expression on his face was bewilderment, and beneath that, deep enough that she almost missed it, fear. "Get your things," Theron said. "We leave within the hour." Sable did not own enough to fill the hour. She packed her single bag in 4 minutes, locked the cottage door with hands that would not stop trembling, and climbed into the supply cart at the back of the column, because no one had thought to arrange anything else for a reject Omega being transported to the palace alongside the most valuable warhorse in the kingdom. Ethan walked beside the cart the entire way, his head level with her shoulder, and the soldiers gave them both a wide, uneasy berth. She watched the cottage shrink behind her and tried not to think about the fact that it was the only place in the world where she had ever felt safe, and she had no idea if she would ever see it again. The journey took most of the day. The soldiers rode in formation, their conversation kept low and clipped, and not one of them spoke to her. She was cargo, an inconvenience being transported alongside the real prize. Sable kept her head down and her hands folded in her lap, and tried to make herself as forgettable as possible, but Athon made that impossible. The stallion walked beside the cart with a possessive calm that drew stares from every rider in the column. Twice, a handler tried to take his lead rope and guide him to the front. Twice the horse planted his hooves and refused to move until the handler backed away. By the 3rd hour, the soldiers had stopped trying and simply rode around him like water flowing past a boulder. Sable watched the landscape change from forest to farmland to the first outlying villages of the capital. The houses grew taller, the roads grew wider. The air changed, thickening with smoke and the smell of too many people living too close together. And ahead, rising above it all, like a fist of gray stone against the afternoon sky, the palace. The royal stables smelled of cedar shavings and old leather and the particular musk of creatures far more important than Sable would ever be. She stood in the center of the stone corridor with her single bag at her feet and tried not to touch anything. Athon had been led into his stall an hour earlier. Or, rather, Sable had been led into the stables and Ethan had followed, ignoring every handler who approached him, and nearly trampling a groom who made the mistake of stepping between them. The stallion was now standing in his stall, with his head hanging over the door, watching her with dark, unblinking eyes that made her feel simultaneously comforted and deeply unsettled. "He has not eaten in 3 months," Theron said from behind her. "Not properly. The handlers have managed water and some grain, but nothing close to what he needs. He has lost nearly a 1/5 of his body weight." Sable looked at the horse. She could see it now, the hollows behind his shoulders, the way his coat had lost its shine. When she had found him collapsed in the woods near her cottage, she had thought he was dying. She had dragged water from the stream in a cooking pot, had torn up her last clean linen to bandage the gash on his foreleg, had slept beside him on the frozen ground for 2 nights before he stood. "He ate for me," she said. Back at the cottage, whatever I put in front of him, Theron studied her. Hay, oats, wild grass, windfall, apples when I could find them. She paused. He is quite fond of carrots. The beta's stance shifted, the kind of minute adjustment a person made when information landed differently than expected. Wait here. He left. Sable stood alone in the corridor. The stable was vast and immaculate, every beam polished, every stall door bearing an engraved nameplate. She counted 14 horses in total. War horses, every one, bred for battle and bonded to senior members of the King's Guard. None of them watched her the way Ethan did. She approached his stall, and the stallion huffed softly, pressing his nose into her palm. His breath was warm and sweet with grain dust. "What are you doing?" she murmured to him. "You had a perfectly good life here, an entire stable of people to take care of you. Why on earth would you choose me?" The horse blinked and leaned into her touch. She rubbed the flat of his forehead, scratching the spot behind his ears that always made his lower lip droop. Footsteps. She pulled her hand back and turned to find, not Theron, but the king. Calder Voss stood at the entrance to the stable corridor, his frame filling the doorway, and for a terrible suspended moment, they simply looked at each other. He was still wearing the riding coat from the journey. Dust from the road clung to his boots. Up close, under the amber light of the stable lanterns, she could see things the distance had hidden, the bruised shadows beneath his eyes, the tension clamped along his jaw. The way he held his left hand curled at his side, the fingers pressed together as though bracing against a pain no one else could see. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond sleeplessness. He looked hollowed out. "They tell me he ate," the king said. Sable nodded. "Oats and some hay, your majesty. I can try carrots in the morning if the kitchen would spare some." A flicker crossed his face. "Too fast to read." "The kitchen will spare whatever you require." Another silence. Sable could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, filled with all the questions she did not dare ask. Why had his horse chosen her? Why had it rejected its own master? Why did the king look at the animal not with anger, but with what resembled grief? "You found him injured," the king said. "Yes, sire, a gash on his left foreleg, and he was half-starved. I did not know whose horse he was. I only knew he was suffering. And so you helped him. Anyone would have." "No," the king said, his voice dropping. "They would not." He took a step forward. Then another. Sable held very still as he approached the stall. Aethon watched his master come, ears forward, body tense. The king raised his hand, reaching for the stallion's neck. The horse flinched. It was subtle, a ripple of muscle beneath the dark coat, but they both saw it. The king's hand stopped midair. His face went blank. But Sable watched his throat work around a swallow that looked painful. He lowered his hand. "See that she has what she needs," he said to someone behind her, his voice flat and controlled. Then he turned and walked out of the stable without looking back. Sable stared after him, her pulse hammering. Aethon nudged her shoulder gently, but she hardly felt it. She was thinking about the look on the king's face when his own horse flinched from his touch. It was the face of a man who had expected exactly that, and hated being right. Theron appeared beside her. "You will sleep here tonight. A cot has been arranged. In the morning we will discuss a more permanent situation." "In the stable," Sable repeated. "Near the horse." Theron's gaze was unreadable. "Whatever you do, do not leave the stallion's proximity during the night. We want to see how he responds over an extended period." She nodded, not trusting her voice. That night, Sable lay on a narrow cot wedged between hay bales, listening to Aethon breathe in the dark. The stable was warm. She could hear the other horses shifting in their stalls, the creak of old timber, the distant murmur of guards changing watch. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. A sensation brushed the edge of her mind. Not a thought, not a sound, but a pull, like a thread hooked beneath her ribs, drawing her attention toward a place she could not name. She sat up. Aethon was pressed against the stall door, his head turned toward her, his dark eyes wide and urgent. A low whicker escaped his throat, filled with a desperation that sounded disturbingly like a plea. Sable rose and crossed to him. She put her hand on his neck and the world fell away. She was standing in darkness. Not the darkness of the stable, not the comforting black of a room without candles, but a thick, oppressive, living darkness that pressed against her skin and filled her lungs with a smell of iron and rot. And in front of her, chained to the ground by coils of black thorn that cut into its flesh with every breath, was a wolf. It was enormous, bigger than any wolf she had ever seen. Its coat so dark it was almost invisible against the void surrounding it. Its ribs jutted through matted fur. Its eyes, pale gray and agonized, stared at her with a desperate, feral intelligence that made her blood run cold. The wolf opened its mouth and howled, but no sound came out. The chains tightened, the thorns cut deeper, and the wolf's eyes, those pale, pale eyes, were eyes she had seen before. Today, in the stable, in the face of a king watching his horse flinch from his hand, Sable gasped and wrenched her hand from Athon's neck. She stumbled backward, hit the hay bales, and sat down hard on the cot. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. Her hand burned where it had touched the horse. Athon watched her, calm now, his breathing settled. "What was that?" she whispered into the dark. The horse said nothing, obviously, but his eyes held hers in the lantern light, and the silence between them felt like an answer she was not yet ready to understand. The stable master found her at dawn, still sitting on the cot with her blanket pulled around her shoulders and her eyes fixed on nothing. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the wolf, the chains, the thorns cutting into dark fur. "You are being moved," the stable master announced. He was a wiry man named Aldrich, with a perpetually harassed expression of someone whose day had already gone wrong before it began. "King's orders." "Quarters in the East Wing?" Sable blinked. "The East Wing. His Majesty's wing." Aldrich did not look pleased about it. Apparently the horse threw itself against the stall door 3 times during the night. "The hinges are damaged. The carpentry bill alone will take half my monthly budget." She looked at Athon. The stallion stood in his stall, looking remarkably innocent, for a creature who had apparently tried to demolish his own enclosure. "He was trying to reach me," Sable said. "I gathered that," Aldrich replied. "Which is why you are being moved closer, so that my stable remains standing." The East Wing was a world Sable had never been meant to enter. The corridors were paneled in dark oak, the floors laid with thick woven runners that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. Portraits of former kings lined the walls. Their painted eyes followed her as she walked, and she could have sworn every single one of them looked disapproving. The quarters they gave her were small, but finer than anything she had ever occupied. A proper bed, with a mattress. That gave when she sat on it. A window that looked out over the stable yard. A chest for her belongings, which took up roughly 1/10 of the space available, because everything she owned fit inside her single bag. Theron outlined the terms of the arrangement that morning in a sitting room adjacent to the king's study. His voice was calm and precise. "You will care for the horse, feeding, grooming, exercising within the palace grounds. You will remain within the walls at all times. You will not speak of the horse's behavior to anyone outside the king's inner circle." He paused. "In exchange, you will receive quarters, meals, and a stipend equivalent to a junior stable hand." Sable nodded. "And how long does this arrangement last?" "Until the horse no longer requires your presence." Theron regarded her with a look that suggested she had arrived at the question faster than he had expected. "Then I suppose you will become very good at grooming." The first days blurred together in a rhythm that was foreign and uncomfortable in equal measure. She rose before dawn and went to the stables. Athon greeted her with the same warm enthusiasm every morning, pressing his nose into her shoulder and breathing against her neck until she scratched the spot behind his ears. She fed him, groomed him, walked him in the paddock. He behaved perfectly for her. For everyone else he was a disaster. He bit a groom who tried to change his water, kicked the wall when a handler entered his stall without her present, refused grain from any hand that was not hers. The staff gave him a wide berth and gave her looks that ranged from suspicious to openly resentful. She was used to those looks. She had been receiving them her entire life. The particular expression a person wore when they could not understand why something valuable had attached itself to someone so clearly without value. The king she barely saw. He was a presence felt rather than witnessed. A door closing at the end of a corridor, a low voice carrying through stone walls, the occasional distant sound of boots on marble that made her pulse spike before fading into silence. When they did cross paths, he acknowledged her with a short nod, and nothing more. His face was always controlled, always composed, and always carrying that same bone-deep exhaustion she had noticed in the stable that first night. She began to observe him the way she observed injured animals, from a distance, cataloging the symptoms without letting on that she was watching. He favored his left side when he walked. Not enough for most people to notice, but Sable had spent years reading the body language of creatures who could not speak. A pain lived in him, and he was very good at hiding it. His hand shook occasionally. She saw it twice in the first week. Once, when he reached for a door handle, and his fingers trembled against the iron before clenching into a controlled fist. Once at a distance across the courtyard, when he gripped the pommel of a sword during a training demonstration, and his knuckles went white with effort that should not have been necessary for a man of his strength, and his eyes. She kept noticing his eyes, not because they were beautiful, though they were. That pale gray shot through with silver that made her stomach do inconvenient things, but because they were wrong. There was a light behind them that flickered like a flame guttering in a draft. A fight happening where no one could see it. On the 6th evening, she was in the stable late, brushing out Athon's mane by lantern light. The palace had settled into its nighttime hush. The other horses dozed in their stalls. The air smelled of hay and warm animal, and the faint sweetness of the oat mash she had mixed that afternoon. She heard footsteps and went still. The king appeared at the far end of the corridor. He did not see her. She was tucked into the shadow of Athon's stall, the lantern low, her dark hair and plain clothes blending into the dimness. He moved differently when he thought he was alone. The controlled composure was gone. His shoulders were hunched, his gait uneven, and his breathing came in shallow, ragged pulls that she could hear even from 20 paces away. He stopped at Ethan's stall. The stallion's ears pricked forward, and the horse made a low, mournful sound that Sable had never heard from him before. A greeting, and a lament woven into a single breath. Calder pressed his forehead against the horse's neck. His hands gripped the stall door until his knuckles went white. And the sound that escaped him was so raw, so stripped of pretense, that Sable felt it land in her own chest like a physical blow. Then his body convulsed. It was violent and brief, a shudder that ran through him from crown to feet. Sable watched in frozen horror as dark fur surfaced along his forearms and vanished. His spine arched, his jaw clenched, so hard she heard his teeth grind. For one terrible flickering second, she saw the shift trying to happen, his body straining toward a form it could not reach, muscles and bone and sinew pulling toward a shape that refused to come. Then it receded, and he collapsed forward against the horse, his chest heaving, his forehead still pressed to Ethan's neck. "It is getting worse," he whispered. The words came out broken, meant for no one but the animal. "I cannot hold it much longer." Sable did not move, did not breathe. Her hand was frozen on the grooming brush, her body pressed against the stall wall. She had just seen the Alpha King's darkest secret. The wolf inside him was dying. And from the way he spoke, from the hopelessness bleeding through every syllable, he had already accepted that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Sable told no one what she had seen. She lay awake that night, replaying it behind her closed eyes, the dark fur surfacing and vanishing, the sound of his teeth grinding. The way his body had strained toward a form that refused to come, like a door being forced against a lock that would not give. She had seen injured wolves before. In the wild settlements where she had scraped together her living after being cast out, she had tended to shifters who came back from hunts with broken bones and torn flesh. She knew what a healthy shift looked like. Fluid, natural, the body unfolding into its second form, the way water found its level. What she had witnessed in the stable was the opposite of that. It was a body at war with itself. The next morning, she went to Ethan early and pressed her face against his warm neck. "You knew," she said. "That is why you came to me. Not because of carrots. Not because I bandaged your leg. Because your master is in trouble, and you think I can help." The stallion breathed against her hair. His calm felt deliberate, as though he understood exactly what she was saying, and was simply waiting for her to catch up. 3 weeks passed. The rhythm of Sable's days settled into a shape that almost resembled a life. She groomed Ethan every morning, walked him in the paddock before the palace woke, mixed his feed with the particular combination of oats and apple mash that made him close his eyes in satisfaction. She learned the routines of the household, which corridors were empty at which hours, which servants would speak to her and which pretended she did not exist, where to sit in the kitchens so she could eat without drawing attention. She also learned where the king walked. She did not follow him. She was careful about that. But the east wing was his wing, and their paths crossed in the natural course of a day, lived in close quarters. She would hear his voice through a closed door, would see his shadow on the far side of the courtyard, would find evidence of him in small, indirect ways that she collected without meaning to. On the 8th day, a blanket appeared on her bed, not the thin, serviceable one that had come with the room, but a heavy wool throw lined with fur so soft it felt like a whisper against her skin. No note, no explanation. When she asked Theron, the beta looked at her blankly and said he had no idea what she was talking about. On the 11th day, she found a bundle of carrots outside the stable. Not kitchen scraps. Proper fat ones, with the greens still attached. The kind that cost 3 times what the palace usually spent on horse feed. She asked Aldrich where they had come from. "Royal requisition," the stable master said, with a look that suggested he found the entire situation deeply beneath his dignity. "Apparently, someone with authority believes this horse requires premium root vegetables." On the 14th day, the window in her quarters, which had been sticking since she arrived, making it impossible to open more than a crack, was fixed. She had not reported it to anyone. She had not mentioned it to anyone. And yet a carpenter appeared, adjusted the frame, oiled the hinges, and left without a word. Sable sat on her bed that evening and stared at the window. The evening air drifted in, cool and sweet with the scent of the stable yard. Someone was paying attention, someone was listening, and that someone was very committed to pretending they were doing nothing of the sort. She found the king in the corridor 2 days later. An accidental meeting, or so she told herself. He was coming from his study, a sheaf of papers in his hand, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. "Your Majesty," she said, stepping aside to let him pass. He nodded. The standard acknowledgement, but he did not keep walking. "The horse," he said, "how is he?" "Eating well. His weight is coming back. The coat is improving." She paused. "He is fond of the carrots." The tips of his ears darkened. "I am not aware of any special carrot arrangement." "Of course not, sire." A silence settled between them. Not the terrible weighted kind that had characterized their first encounter, but a gentler thing, almost companionable. "The window in my quarters was repaired," Sable said before she could stop herself. "And a blanket appeared. A very nice one. I have no knowledge of blankets." Naturally, his jaw tightened, but not with displeasure. It was the look of a man who had been caught doing a kindness, and had absolutely no idea how to handle the accusation. "Thank you," Sable said softly. He looked at her then, actually looked at her. Not the cursory assessment of the first day, not the controlled nod of passing in corridors, but a genuine, unguarded look that lasted 2 full seconds longer than it should have. "You are welcome," he said. Then he seemed to realize what he had admitted and cleared his throat. For whatever unnamed thing you are thanking me for, Sable bit back a smile. He turned and walked away, and she watched him go and noticed that his gait was less uneven than it had been a week ago. The warmth of that observation carried her through the rest of the evening. The conversations grew from there. Not long ones, not intimate ones, small exchanges in corridors and doorways that lasted 30 seconds at most, but that Sable replayed for hours afterward. He asked about the horse, she told him. She asked about his day. He deflected, but less each time. She told him about the groom, who had tried to braid Ethan's mane and nearly lost a finger, and his face did a thing she had never seen it do before. The hard line of his mouth softened, and the corners lifted by a fraction. And his eyes changed in a way that was so close to warmth, it made her breath catch. On the 20th day, she was walking Athon in the lower paddock when she found the king already there, leaning against the fence with his arms folded, watching the hills beyond the palace walls. He had not seen her approach, and for a moment she simply stood and looked at him. The wind moved through his hair. The late afternoon light caught the silver in his eyes and turned them almost translucent. He looked lonely, in a way that had nothing to do with being alone, and everything to do with being surrounded by people who could not reach him. Ethan nickered softly, and the king turned. Their eyes met across the paddock, and for the first time, he did not look away first. Something passed between them in that silence, unspoken and unnameable, and Sable felt the thread beneath her ribs pull taut. "Your Majesty," she said, bringing the horse to the fence. "You are here early." He straightened, the mask settling back into place, but slower than usual, as if it no longer fit as well as it once had. The council finished ahead of schedule. He said, "A rarity, a good day." Then he considered this. "Better than most," he allowed. And then, so faintly she almost missed it, his gaze dropped to the horse standing between them, and he added, "Better now." Sable's heart did a complicated, painful thing that she chose not to examine too closely. "You talk to the horse," he said one morning. She had not heard him approach and startled. He stood at the paddock fence, watching her walk Athon in slow circles. "Everyone talks to horses," she replied. "Not conversations. You speak to him as though he answers. He does answer. He just does not use words." The king's pale eyes tracked the stallion's movements. Athon walked the circle with his head low, relaxed, his tail swishing lazily. The picture of contentment. He was never this calm before. The king said, his voice dropping. "Even with me, even before, he was always restless, always watching the edges of things." "He feels safe," Sable said. The king's gaze snapped to hers, sharp and searching, and she felt the weight of it settle against her sternum like a hand pressing down. "How do you know?" he asked. "Because I know what restlessness looks like," she said simply. "And I know what it looks like when it stops." He held her gaze for a long, measured beat, then he looked away, and the muscle in his jaw worked around words he chose not to say. That night, Sable dreamed of the wolf again. The thorns, the pale gray eyes staring at her from the darkness. But this time, the wolf was not howling. It was lying on its side, its breathing shallow and labored, and the thorns had grown deeper into its flesh. New vines had appeared, wrapping around its throat, tightening with each breath. Whatever was killing him was getting worse. She woke with her hand pressed flat against the wall that separated her quarters from the stable, her palm burning, Ethon's frantic whinny echoing through the stone. The morning after the dream, Sable found Theron waiting for her outside the stable. "Walk with me," the beta said. He led her through a part of the palace she had not seen before, down a narrow staircase, into a lower corridor that smelled of dried herbs and tallow candles. They stopped outside a heavy wooden door. Theron knocked twice and pushed it open. The room beyond was a healer's study. Shelves of glass jars lined the walls. A long workbench dominated the center, covered in open books and handwritten notes. And behind the bench, her gray hair pulled back severely from a weathered face, stood a woman whose eyes could have cut glass. "This is Maeve," Theron said, "the king's physician. She has questions." Maeve did not waste time on pleasantries. "Sit," she said, pointing to a stool. Sable sat. "How close are you to the horse during the night?" Maeve asked. "My quarters are adjacent to the stable. The wall between my room and his stall is roughly 4 inches of stone. And the horse sleeps through the night." "Yes, every night. Every night since I arrived." Maeve exchanged a look with Theron that Sable could not decipher. Then the healer leaned forward, her gaze uncomfortably direct. "The stallion has not slept through the night since the king returned from the Ashenmere campaign, 14 months. The animal paced its stall until dawn, every single night. It stopped eating, its coat dulled. It attacked any handler who approached. 3 weeks before it disappeared from the stable entirely, it broke a groom's arm." She paused. "Now it sleeps like a foal and eats carrots from your hand. I need to understand why." Sable's pulse quickened. "I do not know why. You are an Omega, a rejected one." "Rejected by fools," Maeve said, dismissively. "Your scent carries a quality I have been researching in the old records. There are documented cases, very rare, of Omegas whose natural presence produces a stabilizing effect on bonded creatures, a resonance that calms the nervous system at a fundamental level." Sable stared at her. "You think the horse responds to the way I smell. I think the horse is a bonded warhorse that shares a soul link with his rider, and I think whatever calms the animal may calm the man." Maeve sat back and folded her arms. "I want to test this." The test was simple in concept and agonizing in execution. That evening, instead of going to the stable, Sable was led to a sitting room adjacent to the king's study. A chair was placed against the wall. She was told to sit in it and do nothing. The king arrived 15 minutes later with Theron and 2 advisors. He glanced at her, frowned, and turned to Theron. "What is this?" he said flatly. "An experiment," Theron replied. Maeve's recommendation. His face tightened with a resistance she could read even from across the room. He looked at her again longer this time, and she felt the scrutiny, like heat against her skin. "Fine," he said, the word sharp and bitten off. He sat at his desk. The advisors spoke. Papers were reviewed. Sable sat motionless against the wall, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to disappear. 20 minutes passed. The king's pen slowed. His questions grew shorter, his responses delayed by half a beat. Sable watched the tension drain from his shoulders in increments so small that no one else seemed to notice. At 40 minutes, his head dipped. He caught it at once, snapping upright with a sharp breath. His hand went to his temple. He pressed his fingers against his skull and forced his attention back to the document. But she had seen it. And so had Theron. At 50 minutes, it happened again. His eyelids grew heavy. His pen stopped moving. His breathing changed, deepening into a rhythm that was slower, less controlled. At 55 minutes, the king's eyes closed. His head lowered to his folded arms on the desk, and his breathing settled into the unmistakable cadence of sleep. The advisors froze. One of them turned to Theron with wide eyes. The beta raised a hand for silence and looked at Sable. Nobody moved. The king slept for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Sable counted everyone because she could not look away from his face. The hard lines softened in sleep. The permanent tension along his jaw released. He looked younger, almost vulnerable, and a feeling bloomed inside her chest that she did not have a name for and was not sure she wanted one. When he woke, his gaze found her first, not Theron. Not the empty chairs where the advisors had been, her. They stared at each other across the dim room. His eyes were still soft from sleep, unguarded in a way she had never seen, and for 3 heartbeats, neither of them breathed. Then the composure snapped back into place like a door slamming shut. "Tomorrow evening," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Same arrangement. It became routine. Every evening, Sable sat in the chair while the king worked. Every evening, he fell asleep. Not always fast. Some nights it took an hour, some nights longer. But it always happened. And each time he slept longer than the last. And each time he woke, looking at her. She began to notice details. She had no business noticing the way he rolled his sleeves to his elbows when he worked late, exposing forearms that were corded with muscle and scarred in ways that told stories she wanted to hear. The way he pressed his thumb against his lower lip when he was thinking, a gesture so unconscious and so human it made her chest ache. The way he sometimes paused mid-sentence during their evening exchanges and looked at her as though he had forgotten what he was going to say, as though the sight of her had knocked the words clean out of his head. She noticed, too, the way his nightmares had lessened since she started sleeping in his chambers. He still shifted in his sleep, still made sounds that spoke of dreams with teeth, but the violent thrashing had stopped. Whatever her presence did to him, it was working. And every morning when he woke, and his eyes found hers first, before the composure settled, before the king reassembled himself from the man beneath, she saw gratitude so naked it stole her breath. On the 7th evening, the sound of it on the windows filled the study with a rhythmic hush that seemed to pull the last of the tension from the room. The king fell asleep faster than usual, his head resting on his arms within 30 minutes. Sable rose and crossed to the desk. She had not intended to get this close, but the fire needed stoking, and the path to the hearth took her past him, and she stopped. His hand lay open on the desk, palm up, fingers relaxed. The tremor she had noticed weeks ago was visible even in sleep, a fine vibration running through his fingers like a current that would not rest. She reached out without thinking and laid her hand over his. The tremor stopped. His fingers closed around hers. Not tight, not grasping, just a slow, unconscious curl of warm, rough fingers folding over her own. His breathing deepened further, the lines on his face smoothed. Sable stood beside him, her hand in his, her heart beating so hard it hurt, and understood with terrible clarity that she was in very serious trouble. When Theron came to check on them an hour later, he found Sable standing beside the king's desk, her hand still clasped in his, her legs trembling with the effort of not moving. The beta looked at their joined hands, looked at the king's peaceful, sleeping face, looked at Sable. "Maeve will want to know about this," he said, his voice low. "Please do not tell her," Sable whispered. "He will be embarrassed." Theron studied her for a long moment. "You are worried about his dignity," he said, as though this were a remarkable and unexpected development. "Is that not allowed?" she asked. The beta did not answer, but his formality softened by a degree, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth she had never heard from him before. "I will not tell Maeve about the hand, but I will tell her the proximity effect is increasing." He paused at the door. "You should prepare yourself. She will recommend closer contact. Significantly closer." Sable's stomach dropped. "How much closer?" Theron gave her a look that held the faintest trace of sympathy. "I suspect you already know the answer to that." The door closed behind him, and Sable stood alone in the firelit study, the king's hand still holding hers in his sleep, and felt the ground beneath her shift toward a place she could not stop and was no longer certain she wanted to. Maeve's recommendation arrived the next morning, delivered by Theron in the clipped, clinical tone of a man who had clearly rehearsed this conversation several times. The physician believes that sustained proximity during the full sleep cycle will produce a more lasting stabilization effect. She recommends that you sleep in the king's chambers. Sable had been holding a bucket of oats at the time. She set it down very carefully. "In his chambers," she repeated. "A separate bed will be provided. In the king's chambers, adjacent to his." Sable pressed her hands flat against Ethan's stall door and took a long, measured breath. The stallion huffed against her ear as though offering moral support. "And the king has agreed to this?" she asked. Theron's hesitation told her everything. "The king has been informed of the recommendation. That is not what I asked." He did not refuse, also not what I asked. The beta regarded her with what might have been respect. His Majesty expressed reservations, which were overruled by his physician, his beta, and his own inability to remain conscious for more than 4 hours without your presence. He was not pleased. "Wonderful," Sable said faintly. She arrived at his chambers that evening, carrying her single bag and the heavy blanket that had mysteriously appeared on her bed weeks ago. A narrow cot had been set up near the far wall, dressed with plain linens. The king's bed dominated the opposite side of the room like a dark wooden island. Calder stood by the window with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression she had learned to recognize as controlled discomfort. "This is temporary," he said, without preamble. "Of course, it is a medical arrangement, entirely. I do not want you to feel obligated or uncomfortable. I appreciate that, sire. If at any point you wish to leave, you are free to do so. This is not an order." "Understood." A silence settled between them. It was thick and charged and full of all the things neither of them was saying. "I talk in my sleep sometimes," Sable offered. Fair warning. His brow creased. "What do you say?" "I do not know. I am asleep." The ghost of a smile moved across his mouth. Not quite the real thing, but the closest she had seen, and it vanished before she could hold on to it. They established a routine that was painfully, excruciatingly polite. She prepared for bed while he worked at his desk. He extinguished the candles while she faced the wall. They said goodnight in voices that were too formal for people who were about to sleep 10 feet apart. The first night she lay awake, listening to his breathing, slow and deepen as sleep took him. It happened faster than it ever had in the study. Within 15 minutes the king was asleep, and Sable stared at the ceiling and tried to calm the persistent, traitorous hammering of her heart. The proximity was different here. In the study she had been a functional presence, a chair against a wall, a tool for a medical purpose. Here in the dark, with the sound of his breathing filling the room and the scent of him saturating every surface, she was acutely, impossibly aware of him as a person. She could hear the rustle of sheets when he shifted, could feel the warmth of the room change when he turned toward her, could sense, through a channel she did not understand and could not name, the exact moment his sleep deepened, from light to heavy, from heavy to dreamless. A connection was growing between them, not proximity, not medical necessity. It had roots deeper than either and a pull stronger than both. She felt it in her chest, a warmth that flared when he was near and hollowed when he was gone. She felt it in her skin, the way her body oriented toward him, like a compass finding north. She felt it in the place behind her ribs where her wolf should have been. The small, dormant wolf that had never fully manifested. The one the Ashmore pack had called broken when they threw her out. That wolf was stirring. Nights passed. They talked more in the dark, not about important things at first. She told him about the woods near her cottage, the way the frost made the branches look like glass in the early morning. He told her that Aethon had been the runt of his sire's last litter, and that no one had wanted him. "So you chose him," Sable said. "He chose me," the king corrected. "I walked into the stable and he followed me out, refused to go back." The breeder was furious. "He has a habit of choosing people." Then a pause. "It would seem so," the king said, and his voice had gone soft in a way that made her chest tight. On the fourth night, she woke to the sound of him thrashing. Sharp, bitten-off sounds escaped his throat. His body was rigid, his hands clenched in the sheets. Sable rose and crossed to his bedside before the conscious part of her mind could object. "Calder," she said. His name, not his title. It came out without thought. He did not wake. His face was contorted with a pain beyond nightmare, his body arching against the mattress as though fighting invisible restraints. And beneath his skin, she could see it again. The shift trying to force its way through. Dark fur rippled across his arms and vanished. His hands curled into shapes that were not quite hands. A sound tore from his chest that was half human and half animal and wholly agonized. Sable grabbed his hand. The world shattered. She was in the dark place again. The void, the chains, the thorns. But it was worse now, so much worse. The wolf lay on its side, its breathing ragged and thin. The thorn vines had multiplied, wrapping around its legs, its chest, its throat. They pulsed with a sickly light, tightening with each breath, and standing around the wolf, arranged in a loose, watching circle, were figures, not ghosts, not memories, older and colder and more deliberate. They had faces that shifted like smoke, and they whispered in voices that scraped against the inside of her skull. "Murderer," they whispered. "Butcher king." You tore them apart and called it duty. "Animal," they hissed. You lost control. You let the beast take over, and they paid the price. "You deserve this," they crooned, almost gentle. "You know you deserve this." Sable stumbled forward, bile rising in her throat. The wolf's eyes found her. Those pale gray eyes, dimmer now, the light in them guttering. Then she saw it. Beyond the wolf, beyond the whispering figures, the void opened into a landscape she had not seen before. A burned settlement, bodies in the ash. And at the center, a massive, dark wolf, standing over the wreckage, with blood on its muzzle and horror in its eyes. The wolf was him, Calder. His shifted form, standing in the aftermath of a catastrophe, a moment when the beast inside him had slipped its leash and the man had lost control. The memory, replayed on a loop. The village. The screams. The moment the wolf turned and saw what it had done, the whispering figures drew closer. The thorns tightened. The wolf's breathing grew shallow. "No!" Sable shouted. She pulled at the thorns with her bare hands. They bit into her palms, drawing blood that hissed and steamed where it touched the vines. The pain was extraordinary, but one of the vines loosened. Just enough. The wolf's eyes widened. The whispering figures turned toward her, their smoke faces twisting with surprise and fury. Sable was wrenched backwards so hard her teeth rattled. The void collapsed. She was back in the king's chambers, gasping, her hand still gripping his. Her palms were bleeding, thin cuts across both hands, seeping red in the firelight, cuts that should not have existed from a vision that should not have been real. Calder was awake. He was staring at her hands, at the blood, at the proof that she had been inside his nightmare, that she had seen everything. His face went white. "You were there," he said. His voice was a whisper. Her hands shook. The blood dripped onto his sheets. "You saw it," he continued, and each word sounded like it cost him a vital organ. "You saw what I did, Calder. Please listen to me. Get out." The words hit her like a closed fist. She flinched backward, and his hand released hers as though her skin had burned him. "Get out of this room." He was on his feet, his body trembling, his eyes wild in the firelight. "Get out of this wing. Get out of this palace." "No, let me explain what I saw." Sable started. "You saw a monster." His voice cracked on the word. "You saw exactly what I am. A king who cannot control his own beast. A wolf that destroyed a village of innocent people because I was too weak to hold it back." He turned away from her, his hands gripping the bedpost until the wood groaned. "I will not let that creature touch you. Do you understand? I will not let what is inside me anywhere near you." "That is not your choice to make," Sable whispered. "It is exactly my choice." He still would not look at her. "You are not safe here. You were never safe here. Theron will arrange transport back to your cottage in the morning. And Ethan," she managed, her voice breaking. He flinched at the horse's name. "The horse will adjust. He will not. You know he will not. Then he will suffer as I do." The king's voice dropped to a hollow final register. "As we all do. That is the cost of being near me." He turned to face her one last time. His eyes were dry but ravaged, stripped of every defense, and what she saw beneath the composure was shame. Bottomless and absolute and aimed entirely inward. "Go," he said, "while I can still ask gently." Sable gathered her things with numb, bleeding hands. She walked to the door on legs that did not feel like her own. She paused with her hand on the iron handle. "You are not a monster," she said without turning around. She closed the door behind her and stood in the empty corridor, pressing her bleeding palms against the cold stone, and heard through the thick oak the sound of the Alpha King breaking apart. The cottage was exactly as she had left it. The hole Ethan had kicked through the fence, the trampled garden, the rain barrel, standing empty against the wall. Sable stood in the doorway with her single bag at her feet and felt the silence close around her like a fist. She had not cried during the carriage ride, had not cried when Theron, his face blank, had handed her an envelope containing 3 months' wages she had not earned and did not want. Had not cried when Ethan's frantic, screaming whinnies had followed the carriage down the road until distance swallowed them. She cried, now. Sitting on the floor of her empty cottage, with her back against the wall and her cut palms pressed to her eyes. She cried until her chest ached and her throat burned, and then she stopped because there was no one to hear and no point in continuing. 3 days passed. Sable repaired the fence, replanted what she could in the garden, drew water from the stream, ate when she remembered to, which was not often. The food tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing. On the 4th day the headaches started. They came in waves, low and grinding at first, building to a sharp, blinding pressure behind her eyes that made her vision swim. She brewed willow bark tea and drank it until her stomach protested. The headaches did not care. On the 5th day, the cold set in. Not the external cold of late autumn creeping through the cottage walls, but an internal cold that started in her chest and spread outward, filling her limbs with a heaviness that made lifting a water bucket feel like hauling stone. Her wolf, the small waking thing that had been stirring in the king's presence, went silent, not dormant, not resting, silent in the way a creature goes silent when it is losing the strength to make sound. Sable pressed her hand to her sternum and felt the absence like a wound. The thread she had sensed, the pull beneath her ribs that had drawn her toward him, was still there. But it was taut, now stretched to its limit, vibrating with a tension that sent pain radiating through her body with every heartbeat. On the 7th day, she could not get out of bed. She lay on her side, staring at the cracked plaster of the wall, and counted her breaths, because counting gave her a focus beyond the crushing emptiness in her chest. Her hands had healed. The cuts from the thorns had closed into thin white lines across her palms, but they ached constantly, a phantom pain that throbbed in time with her pulse. She thought about him. She could not stop thinking about him. The way his face softened in sleep, the way his ears darkened when she caught him being kind, the way he had said, "You are welcome," and then tried to take it back. The way his hand had closed around hers in the dark, warm and rough and desperately gentle. She thought about the wolf in chains, the thorns tightening, the figures whispering their poison. She thought about how every night she was not there, no one was pulling at those vines, no one was fighting. He was alone in the dark with the worst version of himself, and the memory of everything he had done, and he believed he deserved it. She tried to eat. The bread sat in her stomach like a stone. She tried to work in the garden, but her hands shook too badly to grip the trowel. She tried to sleep, and when she did, she dreamed of the void, the thorns, the wolf growing weaker. And she would wake gasping with tears on her face, and her hands outstretched toward a bed that held no one. On the 9th day, a rider arrived. Sable heard the hoofbeats from her bed, and could not summon the energy to stand. The door opened without a knock. Footsteps crossed the room. Theron stood over her, and for the first time since she had known him, the beta's composure cracked. His face went tight with alarm. "How long have you been like this?" he asked, dropping to one knee beside the bed. "A few days," Sable managed. Her voice came out thin and papery. "You look half dead." "That seems dramatic." Theron did not smile. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead and swore under his breath. "You are freezing! In a room with a fire! The fire went out yesterday, or the day before. I cannot remember." He was on his feet at once, building the fire back up with quick, efficient movements. Then he was back at her side, pulling the blanket, the good one, the one that had appeared in her quarters at the palace, up to her chin. "The king," she said. "How is he?" Theron's jaw tightened. "Worse." How much worse? The beta sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her with an openness she had never seen from him before. Athon has not eaten since you left. He destroyed his stall on the third day, kicked through 2 walls and injured a handler badly enough to require stitching. He paused. They have moved him to the outer paddock. He stands at the fence facing the road, waiting. Sable closed her eyes. And the king, she opened them again. The king has not slept in 9 days. He collapsed during a council session on the 6th day. Maeve has been administering stimulants to keep him functional, but his body is deteriorating. The shift episodes are occurring during waking hours now. He lost partial control in his study 2 days ago. Furniture was destroyed. A guard was hurt. The words landed like blows. Sable forced herself upright, her arms trembling with the effort. He sent me away. Yes. He ordered me to leave. He did. Then why are you here? Theron looked at her steadily. Because Maeve believes you share a bond with the king. Not a medical arrangement. Not a proximity effect. A true mate bond, forming despite every obstacle both of you have placed in its way. He let the words settle. And she believes that if it continues to be denied, it will kill you both. Sable stared at him. The word mate sat in the air between them, enormous and terrifying, and exactly right. He will not accept it, she whispered. He thinks he is protecting me. He is wrong. He will refuse to see me. Almost certainly. Theron stood and extended his hand. So, I suggest you stop asking for permission. The ride back to the palace took 4 hours. Sable spent most of it wrapped in the blanket in the back of a covered carriage, her body aching, her head pounding, the thread beneath her ribs singing with increasing urgency. As the distance closed, she felt him before she saw the walls. A warmth kindling in her chest, faint at first, and then building, spreading through her body, like blood, returning to frozen limbs. Her wolf stirred, weakly. But there, Theron brought her in through a side entrance. The corridors were dim, the palace hushed in the way it only got very late at night. He led her to the king's chambers and stopped. I cannot go in with you, he said. If he knows I brought you back, he will have my head. He will have my head too. Yes, but you are his mate. The punishment will be significantly different. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. For what it is worth, I believe you are the bravest person in this palace. Or the most foolish. Often, the same thing. He left her at the door. Sable stood in the dark corridor, her hand on the iron handle, and took a breath that hurt all the way down. She pushed the door open. The room was destroyed. A chair splintered against the far wall, deep gouges in the floorboards where claws had raked through wood. The fire was dead. The candles were out. The only light came from the moon through the window, casting silver across the wreckage. Calder sat on the floor with his back against the bed, his knees drawn up, his head bowed. He was shirtless. She could see the damage the failed shifts had done. Dark bruises mottled his torso. His hands were bloody, the knuckles split. His breathing was ragged and uneven. He looked up when the door opened, and the sound he made when he saw her was not a word. It was a sound that existed before language, the raw, involuntary noise of a man, seeing the only thing in the world he wanted, and the only thing he had convinced himself he could not have. No, he said, his voice was wrecked. No, I told you to go. And I went, Sable said, stepping inside. It nearly killed me. It is killing you. So I came back. You cannot be here. I am here. I will hurt you. He pressed the heels of his bloodied hands against his eyes. I cannot control it. The wolf is dying. And when it dies, I do not know what will be left. I am not safe. Sable crossed the ruined room. Glass crunched under her bare feet. She knelt in front of him and pulled his hands from his face. Look at me, she said. He resisted. She held firm. Calder, look at me. His eyes met hers. They were bloodshot, red-rimmed, and so full of fear and longing and self-loathing that her heart cracked open at the sight. You and I, you know it. You have known it since the stable. Since Athon chose me, Since you started leaving blankets and fixing windows and ordering carrots you claim to know nothing about. A sound escaped him, half laugh and half sob. I am not leaving again, she continued, her voice steady even as tears ran down her face. You can order me out, you can growl and slam doors, and destroy every piece of furniture in this palace. But I will come back, every single time. Because I would rather face whatever is inside you than spend one more night without you. His hands were shaking in hers, his entire body trembled. The composure, the control, the iron will that had held a kingdom together while he fell apart. All of it crumbled. I killed them, he whispered. The village. I lost control during the campaign. My wolf took over and I could not stop it, and when I came back, they were gone. All of them. He could not finish. His breath hitched violently. I know, Sable said. I saw it. And I am still here. Why? He choked. Because you are not the worst thing you have ever done. She brought his bloodied hand to her lips and pressed a kiss to his broken knuckles. And neither am I. He broke. His arms wrapped around her, and he pulled her against his chest with a desperation that stole her breath. He held her so tightly it hurt, and she held him back just as hard, and the bond between them flared like a coal blown to flame, pouring warmth into the frozen places inside both of them. Stay, he said against her hair. The word was almost inaudible. Always, she whispered back. He kissed her then, not gently, not with restraint, not with the measured control of a king addressing a subject. He kissed her like she was air and he had been drowning. His bloodied hands cradled her face, her fingers threaded through his hair. The taste of him filled her mouth, and the scent of him filled her lungs, and the warmth of him filled every hollow place inside her that had been empty for as long as she could remember. She pulled him closer, needing the contact she had been starved of, and he held her like he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. The bond between them flared like a coal blown to flame, pouring warmth into the frozen places inside both of them. He pressed his forehead to hers and breathed her in, and she felt, the moment the bond sealed, it locked into place deep in her chest, a golden thread that wound through her ribs and anchored itself to something vital, permanent, unbreakable. He bit down gently on the curve of her neck, the mating mark, instinctive and claiming, and the bond blazed brighter. She marked him back, pressing her teeth to his shoulder, and felt his answering shudder run through them both. The bond settled into a steady, pulsing warmth that said mine, and meant it. Afterward, he held her against his chest and breathed, deep, steady, peaceful breaths. His hand traced slow circles on her back. I have not slept in 9 days, he murmured. It was unbearable. You did not sleep 9 days without me, Sable corrected. You went 9 days without sleeping. There is a difference. She pressed her face into his neck and smiled. He fell asleep holding her. She felt the exact moment it happened. The way his body surrendered completely, the way his breathing deepened past the point of consciousness, the way his arm tightened around her waist, even in sleep. Sable lay awake, listening to his heart, feeling the bond hum between them. She closed her eyes. She knew what was coming. She could feel the pull of that dark place, the void, the chains, the whispering figures. But this time, she was not afraid. This time, she was going in on purpose. The void was waiting. Sable opened her eyes to darkness, so absolute it had texture. It pressed against her skin, cold and viscous, and the air tasted of iron and sorrow and decay. She stood, steadied herself, and reached for the bond. It was there, a thread of gold in the blackness, thin but steady. She followed it. The landscape materialized around her in fragments. Ash-gray ground that gave beneath her feet, skeletal trees, with bark that wept black sap, a sky that was not a sky, but a low, pressing ceiling of fog that pulsed with a faint, sickly light, and sounds. The whispering had started already, rising from the ground itself, from the trees, from the fog overhead. "He let you in," the voices murmured. "How generous of him. Another lamb for the wolf to devour." Sable kept walking. The golden thread pulled her forward, and she followed it around a stand of dead trees and into a clearing. The wolf lay in the center. It was worse than she had feared. The thorns had multiplied into a cage. They wrapped around the wolf's body so tightly that she could not tell where animal ended and vine began. Each breath the wolf drew caused the thorns to contract, cutting deeper, drawing fresh blood that hissed and blackened where it touched the ground. The wolf's eyes were closed. Its breathing was shallow and irregular. The fur visible between the vines had gone dull, shot through with gray that had not been there before. Calder's wolf was dying, not in the distant, abstract way she had sensed from outside. It was dying here now, in this place, being strangled by a prison built from its own guilt. The figures stood around the clearing, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, smoke-faced and patient and horribly still. They watched her approach with eyes that shifted like oil on water. "He brought us here," one of them said, stepping forward. It wore the face of a young woman, a girl, really. 15, maybe 16. She had wide, frightened eyes, and ash in her hair, and a wound across her stomach that gaped open and would never close. "He did this to us," the girl said. "To me. To all of us." Sable's throat tightened. "Who are you?" "I am Nesta." The girl tilted her head. "I lived in the village. I was carrying water from the well when the wolf came." More figures stepped forward. A man with a crushed arm, a woman clutching a small, still bundle to her chest, a boy with burns across half his face. They spoke in overlapping voices, each one a testimony, each one a weight added to the chains. "He lost control. The beast consumed him. We trusted our king and he became the monster." The thorns tightened. The wolf's breathing stuttered. Sable understood now. She understood with a clarity that was almost cruel. The curse had not created these ghosts. It had not invented the guilt. All it had done was build a room where the guilt could never leave, a prison, with no walls, only mirrors. Every night, Calder's mind came here and watched the worst thing he had ever done play out on an endless, poisonous loop. And the wolf, the part of him that had lost control, bore the punishment. He was killing his own wolf, not the curse. Him. Because he believed the beast deserved to die for what it had done. "You are not memories," Sable said to the figures. Her voice shook, but held. "You are not ghosts. You are his guilt wearing their faces." The girl, Nesta, smiled. It was a sad, knowing smile. "Does that matter? The people we represent were real." "Yes," Sable said. They were. She knelt beside the wolf and began pulling at the thorns. They cut her hands at once. Blood welled from her palms, reopening the scars from her last visit, and the pain was bright and nauseating. The figures moved closer. "You cannot save him," they whispered. "He does not want to be saved." Sable tore a vine free. It came away with a wet, ripping sound, and the wolf's body shuddered. She reached for another. "You are nothing," the voices continued. "A reject, a cast-off, an omega, so broken. Her own pack threw her away. What makes you think you can hold together a king?" The words landed in the tender, bruised places inside her that had never healed. The places where the Ashmore pack's rejection still lived. The place where her mother's abandonment had carved a hollow that she had spent her entire life trying to fill. Sable's hands faltered on the thorns. "They are right," a voice whispered inside her. "You are nothing. You have always been nothing." The golden thread pulsed, faint, but warm, steady, real. Sable closed her eyes and breathed. And when she opened them, she did not speak to the figures. She spoke to the wolf. "I know what they are telling you," she said, her voice raw. "Because they told me the same thing my whole life. That I was broken. That I was not enough. That if I had been worth keeping, someone would have kept me." She pulled another thorn free. Blood ran down her wrists. "And I believed it. For years, I believed it. I believed that the reason I was alone was because I deserved to be alone. That the reason no one chose me was because there was nothing in me worth choosing. The wolf's eyes opened, pale, gray, dim. But Ethan chose me, Sable whispered. He crossed a kingdom and chose me. And you, she swallowed hard. You left blankets on my bed and fixed my window, and ordered carrots for a horse, and fell asleep holding my hand. You chose me, too. Even when you were trying not to, she ripped another vine away. The figures surged forward, their whispers rising to a roar. Murderer, beast, monster. You lost control and people died, Sable said, her voice rising above theirs. That is true. That happened. And it was terrible. And you have carried it every single night for over a year, and it has nearly destroyed you. She pulled the last vine from the wolf's throat. Her hands were slick with blood. The pain was immense. She did not stop. But destroying yourself does not bring them back. Punishing your wolf does not undo what happened. All it does is make sure the people who are still alive, the people who need you, who love you, lose you too. The wolf raised its head. Its gray eyes locked onto hers. I was thrown away, Sable said, her tears falling onto the dark fur. And I spent my whole life trying to earn the right to exist. But I do not have to earn it. She placed both bleeding hands on the wolf's face. You are allowed to survive this, she whispered. You are allowed to live. Please. Please live. The wolf's eyes filled with a light that was not pain. The golden thread between them blazed. The thorns, every last one, crumbled to ash. The figures began to dissolve. One by one, their smoke faces softened, losing the sharp edges of accusation. Nesta, the last to go, looked at Sable with a recognition that was not forgiveness exactly, but was close enough, an acknowledgement, a release. She faded into the fog thinned, the sky lifted, the darkness bled away at the edges. The wolf stood. It was unsteady, its legs trembling, its coat still dull, but it stood, and it pressed its great head against Sable's chest, and she wrapped her arms around its neck, and the bond between them sang. She woke in his arms. Morning light, pale and golden, poured through the window. Her hands ached. She lifted them and saw the thin white scars across her palms, healed and closed, as though weeks had passed instead of hours. Calder was awake. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was open in a way that the king's face was never open, vulnerable in a way she had not known he was capable of. You were there, he said. Yes. You pulled the thorns. Yes. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the scars on her palm. He held there for a long time, his breath warm against her skin. I felt it, he said. The wolf. It is still here. His voice broke. I thought I had lost it. You nearly did. He pulled her closer, his face buried in her hair. His body shook once. A single full-body tremor that ran through him and passed. I do not deserve you, he murmured. Probably not, Sable agreed. But Ethan chose me, so you are stuck. The sound he made was almost a laugh. Almost. It was the closest thing to joy she had ever heard from him, and it settled in her chest alongside the bond and stayed. The wolf did not heal overnight. There were still nights when Calder woke, shaking, when the guilt crept back in and the shadows pressed close, and the memory of what he had done sat heavy on his chest. But Sable was there. She was always there. And slowly, painfully, he learned to speak about it, to name the dead without drowning in them, to carry the weight without letting it crush him. The wolf returned gradually. She saw it first in the way he moved, the old fluidity coming back, the predatory grace that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with a body, finally at peace with itself. Then, one morning, she walked into the courtyard and found a massive black wolf standing beside Ethan in the paddock. The horse's nose rested on the wolf's head. Neither of them moved. Sable leaned against the fence and watched them. and felt a stillness settle into the deepest part of her chest. The kind of stillness that comes after a long, hard journey, when you finally stop walking and realize you have arrived. The court adjusted, grudgingly, loudly, with enough gossip to fuel a decade of kitchen chatter. A rejected Omega as the Alpha King's mate was not what anyone had imagined. The whispers followed her through every corridor, but Calder's hand was always at her back, and his patience for court opinion was spectacularly thin. "They will adapt," he told her one evening, pulling her against his chest, "and if they do not, they will learn to be quiet about it. I have been told I can be quite intimidating." "You cannot even intimidate your own horse," Sable reminded him. "The horse is a unique case." In the stable that night, Sable pressed her forehead to Ethan's neck. The stallion breathed against her hair, slow and content. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing me." She returned to their chambers to find Calder already in bed, one arm extended across her side of the mattress, in a gesture so habitual, he probably did not know he did it. She slid in beside him. His arm folded around her at once, pulling her close, and his breathing deepened within minutes. Sable lay in the dark, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt the bond hum between them, warm, whole, unbreakable. She closed her eyes. No fog, no darkness, no thorns, just peace.